Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special podcast. Today we have a returning guest to the show, Charles Hugh Smith from Of Two Minds, located at of2minds.com. And I got to tell you, I don't just read what Charles writes every time he writes something because he wallows in the problem. I read what Charles writes because he offers specific solutions and actionable information that we can all incorporate on our lives. Because I got to tell you, the markets and the economy aren't really going in the right direction in the United States right now. And if you've got that feeling, and if you're not sure what's going on, or if more importantly, you need to try and figure out what you can do about it, then you need to be reading Charles Hugh Smith's writings too. And that includes his latest book, Global Crisis, National Review, a revolutionary grand strategy for the United States. And we're going to talk about some of the things that's in Charles's latest book today, and we're going to talk about a whole lot more. So Charles, I'd like to thank you for joining us again on Silver Doctors.
Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure.
Now, Charles, I haven't been doing a whole lot of podcasts lately, and I've kind of changed it up a bit because I don't like the format where you just spend 1 second asking one question and then just wait on some canned answer that doesn't do anybody any good. I've changed it up, and I don't like to waste anybody's time. And by that, I mean I like to just dive into the nitty-gritty and actually talk about things that are thought-provoking and important and pressing. So could I just start a little bit talking about a little story that I want us to do just to break off this conversation today, Charles?
Sure.
Okay. Now, it has to do with your latest article, which is also one of the themes that's in your book, your latest book. And your latest article is called, Should You Move While You Can or When You Must? It's actually not your latest article. You're second to the latest article because you're an avid and a great writer. But it's one of your most recent articles. But Charles, this speaks near and dear to my heart, and I want to just lay this out. So please bear with me a minute. Now, I was born in West by God, Virginia, lived there for 12 years. I lived about 25 years in North Carolina. I was raised in North Carolina, lived over the course of 9 years in El Paso, Texas, right? You've got to exclude like a combat deployment to Iraq and a cupcake deployment to Kuwait. And I also lived in Mexico for 2 years. And in Charles, in 2017, my family actually made a conscious decision to move across the country from El Paso, Texas to Ohio. So there's actually a lot of personal things that I can talk about when it pertains to this topic, and just a lot of intricacies about how that happened, how we did it, what it cost, what went well, what didn't go well, and all of these things. So I find that very fascinating because the question that you pose in your article is a very good one. And quite simply, the question just, and I'm paraphrasing, I should have highlighted the question with marker or something like that, but it just comes down to just the basic question, which is, if you can move, should you while you can and on good terms, or if you can't, do you move when you must move because situations get bad? Maybe there's, we're talking about really bad reparations, or maybe there's going to be some sort of socio-economic collapse depending on where the region is. Because, like, for example, for me in El Paso, that's a desert environment, right? There's not enough water. They get their water from Elephant Butte and New Mexico, among one places. So if you believe that water resources are going to be a thing in the future, El Paso is not a great place. Also, there's the fact that, you don't grow enough food within El Paso County to sustain the entire population. Well, that's a problem too. Then you got 7 million people across the border in Juarez, Mexico, and that's a problem too. Then there's a huge federal government footprint in El Paso, and that's a problem too. So Charles is just like on and on and on and on and on that in 2014, 2015, my family and I said, okay, we need to get back to a fertile, sustainable place, preferably somewhere in the East Coast, because that's where I know, although I've come to find out that Ohio is the Midwest and not the East Coast. But we need to, make this decision now. And not only did it take us a couple years to make that decision, and not only did we spend a lot of money out of our pockets to move across the country, but, it's one of those things where once we moved, we spent another year and a half getting to learn this location to actually buy the house, because we first moved to an apartment, because, you don't just move across the country and uproot yourself in that manner without having some sort of strategy and some sort of plan, although we all know it happens to those things. But I'm rambling here, Charles, and I'm ranting here, Charles, and I don't exactly know where I'm headed with all of this. But my point is that I would agree with you in that, the economy is not like, oh, we think inflation's going to moderate this year in 2022 and come down slightly, and we're going to ease interest. No, the economy is so far beyond that point that it blows my mind that people are talking about that. What we're talking about is, depending on what region or what city or what area of the country you're living in, you could have some serious systemic problems coming down the pipeline. So Charles, could you just talk to our viewers and our listeners about what are some of these systemic problems in the United States right now, and why would it force somebody, or whether they want to or not, think about, do I need to move my family? And if I do, where the heck do I go? Start me off with that, please, Charles.
Well, Paul, I'm really glad that you have actually lived through it and the process we're talking about, and I have too. And in the last 4 years, and so it is wrenching and difficult, and so we're not taking it lightly. In other words, both you and I know that it's sort of heck on earth to move. And so you don't do it lightly unless you're 19, and when we all hopefully had that experience somewhere in our late teens or early 20s, where you throw everything in the back of the truck or the car and hope it makes it to your next destination, but everything you own's in the back seat in the trunk. and so that's the easy way to do it. But as you get older, that's hard. Let me kind of try to contextualize our conversation by saying we're talking about these large abstract problems, right? They're abstractions, but then they do have impact on us as individuals. And so then we have to make individual decisions. And so the abstract realities are, and this is what my premise of my book is, inequality in the U.S. has reached such extremes that it's going to create social turmoil, and that turmoil could lead to kind of a cascade of collapse in ways that nobody thinks is possible. But history tells us when you get these extremes of inequality and democracy's broken down and so on, that things start falling apart, right? And people get more divisive, and they can't find anything to agree on, and that kind of stuff. And so then your path to solutions dissolves away. So the other thing I mentioned is scarcity. Like you mentioned inflation. Well, inflation and scarcity go together, right? So the basic idea, I think, that I find persuasive is we've already used up all the easy stuff on the planet. Right. In other words, the iron ore, the oil, the natural gas, it's all the easy stuff's gone. And so that's why the world is now suffering these scarcities. Is sure, there's supply chains and all that stuff. And that's another issue. How dependent are you and your family on these supply chains that stretch 3,000 or 5,000 miles? Now, if like to your point about El Paso, and I don't know El Paso, so I'm taking your account. But the idea is, if everything that you need to live comes from hundreds or thousands of miles away, that's a dependency that's very hard to overcome. And then the thing in my mind is, okay, draw a circle of 100 miles around your city or wherever you live. Is there anything there that's actually produced? In other words, are you getting oil out of the ground or natural gas out of the ground? And it's distributed, or is food being grown? Is there a water supply? And if the answer is no, that all that stuff comes from thousands of miles away or hundreds of miles away, well, then where are you going to be when there's triage? In other words, when there's not quite enough to go around, who's going to get the first dibs? And it's going to be, well, more than likely, it's going to be, of course, the super rich, because they can, use their money to buy whatever they want. But beyond that, it's going to be the places that are the locales that are close to the source of these essentials, right? So I think that sort of stands up to just common sense, right? That we've become overly dependent on, and I think sort of filled with unsupported confidence that all the stuff we want will come from 5,000 miles away, no problem. There'll never be any disruption, And it's all like, well, actually, we've found out that there are massive potential disruptions. And so far, it's only been in manufactured stuff from China and the Far East. But you could also see there's a lot of choke points in energy, too. So, and water, as you say, we've drained a lot of the easy water, too, the aquifers and so on. So now it comes down to, what do we do as individuals? And so why don't you walk through what your family did? Because I think that's going to reflect what what's in my book and my article.
Well, and it's funny because my last podcast, I was chatting with, I don't know if it was the last one or the second to the last one, but with Brian Ochsner, and he's a Kansas wheat farmer. And he says the days of the 500-mile loaf of bread and the 3,000-mile Caesar salad are over. And if we look at those reports from last week out of Washington, D.C. with no produce anywhere, I mean, that's kind of playing out to be true. But so that's kind of like number one for me when we were moving was, we need to be in a place that knows how to sustain itself in that sense, right? Like around me in this area, there's enough food grown that there's a surplus. So that's point number one. Do you even have enough food to eat, right? And I mean, if things really got bad, there's like 10 bunnies throughout the summer that live in my yard. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now, Charles, but and I don't even know if that was a pun or not, but that was point number one. And point number two was water, right? Because these are the two most, like whatever pyramid that is, that pyramid of needs or whatever they call it, like those are the two most basic, food and water. And it's like, if you're in an area that doesn't have any of those or that relies on that being brought from somewhere else, that's a problem, Charles, that's a problem. So that was number one. And then number two, it comes down to, and here's what it doesn't come down to. Here's what it doesn't come down to. In my opinion, what it doesn't come down to is taxes. Because in Texas, there's no income tax, right? Oh, Texas is great. They don't have an income tax. I mean, Texas is just the same as every other place in the country, whereas it's okay, yeah, it's special, but no, it's not really that special. And they're going to get you in some other way for the taxes, right? The way taxes work is it's like a rubber band. So if you're not paying it for income, you're paying it somewhere, and they're just going to pull on that rubber band until it snaps, right? So I don't think the taxes are an issue, because like in Ohio, they got federal taxes, state taxes, local income taxes. I got to pay local income taxes. It blows my mind, Charles. But anyway, you got all of these taxes. That's not a reason to move. To me, it's like, does the place where you're moving have the ability to sustain itself, growing food and have enough water, and then be able to logistically maneuver in the region for whatever that even means? And let me tell you what that even means. There's a Jeep plant here, right? So they actually can make Jeeps here. And there's old school manufacturing, and there's like a glass factory, like some of the most famous glass in the United States is made here. So like there's this old manufacturing base, right? Because that kind of like, now I know you talk about this so eloquently in your writings often about like why societies fail or something like that. But this is my personal belief and personal theory, right? My own personal belief is that any region, and I would like to call it a region because I think that in 2022, we kind of live regionally now as opposed to like severely locally. It's certainly not, War of 1812 times. But when it comes to that, like any region, any locale is either in one of three states. It's either rising, which is what El Paso was when we were living there. It's either falling or it has fallen, right? So my thought on moving back to some place in the Rust Belt, that they like to call it, is that, well, it had already fallen. So what does that mean? That means that it can only get better from there. It can only rise from there, Charles. And conversely with El Paso, I mean, there's so much going on in El Paso right now. It can only fall from here, Charles. That's what I see for it. And that's a whole nother story because we're talking about solutions and stuff right now. But so that's one of the things that went into our factor. It's not so much as taxes, but it's so much as, has the area already collapsed? If it's already collapsed, what does that mean? Does that area have a manufacturing base? Can they grow enough food to support themselves? Is there water resources? And then is there all of those things? But then that's not even good enough, because then you've got to realize, well, okay, well, I've got this region down, but I got kids that are going to start high school in a couple of years, and I want them to go to a good school, because I mean, even though it's a good school, it's still public school, and that's crappy. You know what I mean, Charles? So it's like there's all of these factors that go into play where it's like, we started the process of moving around the country in 2014. We moved in 2017. We bought our most recent house in 2019. And anybody who's thinking that they'll just deal with this systemic abstract crisis when it comes, I mean, they're already behind, Charles. I don't know if any of that made any sense at all, but could you help me out? And did I make the right decision here, Charles, or help me explain some of these dynamics a little more for us?
Well, thank you, Paul. And I think you did good. And what I was talking about in my recent article that you referred to was, one of my strategies about life is follow what the rich people are doing, right? I mean, follow what the super rich people. They're the ones that have to get the best advice. They can buy the best advice. And so look at what the super wealthy are doing in the United States. They're snapping up property in Montana and Idaho and North Carolina. I mean, in other words, and even the next tier down, the top 5%, the people that make, 250 to 500,000. Everyone's trying to get a second home out in some place they consider more sustainable and safe than where they're living right now. They're not willing to commit. They're rich enough they don't need to commit to one or the other. So they're going to get the one in some place they want to live when the place they live now, comes apart. So that's a pretty good indication right there of what's happening in the U.S. And so as just anecdotally, I know that my wife and I have liked to go camping when we lived on the mainland, and so I visited many places in the West. And so one of the nicest places is up there by in Montana, and in that part of the country where there's Glacier National Park and so on. Well, houses up there in Kalispell and other small towns went from like 200,000 to 600,000 overnight as all the rich people from LA and New York were buying houses sight unseen. They didn't even need to know anything about it. They just snap it up, cash, boom. And so those of us who aren't super wealthy, we're going to be at a huge disadvantage trying to compete with people that have a ton of money, who are smart enough to get out early. They can sell their crummy house in LA or Brooklyn or whatever for huge sums of money still, and then buy something else in rural America for a lot less. But that's starting to change, right? And you hear these stories about places in North Carolina, for instance, which are the perfect, the small town that everybody likes. Well, then the properties have doubled and tripled, and so it's priced out the locals and anybody with a normal income. So the trick is you've got to find places that are not on the super wealthy, it's not a watch list. In other words, you're not going to be able to afford Aspen, or, Sun Valley in Idaho. I mean, wherever the rich have already been, those aren't going to be the place you're going to be able to afford. And they're often being ruined, right? As people flood in here, the infrastructure, the schools, nothing is made for like triple the population, right? And so you need to start doing your research. And that's what I really liked about what you said, is that you did your research for a couple of years. So yeah, it's not something you can make a decision real quickly unless you have a family farm or a family home. And sadly, those days are gone for most Americans. In other words, there used to be a family farm or a family house. That's gone. Now that's what's different about China. China has grown so fast, 20 years. They still have villages where if you get fired and you lose everything, you can go back to grandma and grandpa's house in the village and you can scrape by. Well, that's too bad. Most people don't have that option in America. So, and one last point is, you look at Ohio Valley, it was considered extremely compelling back in the early growth days of the United States for all the features you mentioned, plenty of rain, rivers, fertile soil, etc. And so all of those sort of fundamentals are still in play.
Very interesting points. And I would follow up on that one more step further, because like when it comes to some of these dynamics about being priced out, like, I don't know if you would consider my town an affluent town or whatever. It's definitely a small town, but there's only one high school in this town. But since we moved here 2 years ago, I mean, I told you before, my property taxes have gone up $200 in 2 years, and I don't even want to know what they're going up this year. But it's like I live on the street with a cul-de-sac, and it's nice because I live after the last stop sign and turn off on the street. But my point is that there's never a house for sale here, ever, on my street. And whenever there's a house for sale, it's immediately gone in a week. And it's weird because it's not like, it's like hardworking people who take pride and they cut their grass and there's not a piece of trash on the sidewalks or anything like that. But yes, these growing pains are real because now, well, there's only one high school here, but now there's like 2 or 3 portable trailers that they're popping up and they look kind of permanent to me on that school property. And it's like, and now I'm thinking, well, my goodness, I mean, yeah, I guess we did choose the right place to live again, because also in addition to that, there's going to be, like something has to happen, because it takes years to get a school going and to get a school built and to build out any of that kind of infrastructure. And we're already squeezing so much tax money out of you from all these other bonds that the voters have already approved for school improvement and all this and all that. So that's another interesting dynamic too, where I just want to emphasize your point that that it's acting, but it's acting with the right information, having the conviction, and doing the hard research about it as you're getting a feel for this and as you're trying to navigate through it. If that made sense, Charles.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about the community, the culture, and you obviously chose well, as you said, because there's other people moving in. Now, you want to choose a place that is conducive to your sort of value system. And let's be honest, not every place feels comfortable. You can line up all the sort of abstractions, like, is there a local community, is food grown, and you can say, well, this looks appealing, but you go there and you don't really feel, you don't feel as comfortable as you do in some other place. So, there's that thing too. Like, for instance, if you have a faith, then you want to go visit the church that you would normally go to, and then you go, well, like, okay, I'm Presbyterian. Maybe there's no Presbyterian church, because the old line churches have faded, or there's a really lively church, for instance, or you're an entrepreneur and you want to look around and you want to make a living. All those, there's other factors. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the factors that were most important to you? You mentioned, of course, owning a house is important, in a neighborhood you like, and then schools for your kids. Mm-hmm. And what about livelihood or the sort of culture? Like, mm-hmm. if you like variety, is there a cafe that you like, or?
Well, just in general, more on the abstract, I want to say a couple things about that, because what you are saying is absolutely important. Because, when it comes to those things, like, just generally speaking, since I've lived in various parts of the country, the only part of the country that I haven't lived is in the Northwest or in like the Montana, Wyoming area, like that. So I've lived in the North, I've lived in the East Coast, I've lived in the Southwest, and now I've lived in the Midwest. But one thing I like about Ohio is, and just in general that helps with my decision making, is that there's just a sense of hard work. People are generally nice. People have a lot of faith, if faith is what you're into. But other than that, it's also one of those places where you can kind of do what you want and people generally leave you alone. And there's this like kind of respect for like freedom, if I can even say that, right? So it's like, yes, my point here is that what you are saying is absolutely true. Like, I mean, I would not survive well going to some, I don't know, like, I probably wouldn't do well if I went and lived back in Chapel Hill, North Carolina again. Right. And not that I would anyway, but probably not. And I mean, I'm sure you could name a lot of those kind of like, and I don't want to label them, but I'm pretty sure you can see where I'm going with these labels. But like, for example, like what's that town in Colorado, like Boulder, Colorado, or one of these places in Colorado, or like San Francisco, or like one of these kind of places where it's very like, on superficially it's welcoming, but in reality it's not, right? So that's one of the considerations. And then it comes down to the fact that there's risk, right? There's risk, right? Like, of course it's going to be a risk, and there's never going to be this whole laundry list of things that meet your needs and meet your desires. Like, for me, I still don't have any family around me, right? Like, the closest family lives 5 hours away. And that's just something that, as individually, as my own personal family, well, in order to take care of my own personal family and be able to be nimble in this unfolding economic dynamic, sometimes I have to move out of the comfort zone and move further away from other people. So that technically was not a huge consideration for me. But another consideration for me was time, and that was a huge consideration. My daughter, I was telling you, went to 5 schools in 6 years. And we made the conscious decision that when my daughter started high school, she was going to start the same high school and finish the same high school, period. So it was also a time thing. And that's what I think is important about your article, because you pose it as it's a choice, but later on it might not be a choice, because if push comes to shove, and let me just talk about the expenses, Charles. It is not cheap to move across the country. And I'm going probably off base here, but this was 2017 when we made the move. And I think I broke a world record. I drove by myself with my dog riding shotgun and a 26-foot U-Haul, the big one, with a trailer on the back, towing my car, my sports car that I've talked about before, my rally car that I don't have anymore. But I did it in 31 hours from El Paso to Toledo, Ohio, and I'm pretty sure that's a world record, but it wouldn't surprise me. But that's not my point. My point is that I don't remember the exact costs for everything. We use that company Pods. I'm sure they still exist, but it's probably way more expensive now. We also use the U-Haul. Like I go on the cheap and try and do things myself. I'd rather drive to Florida than fly to Florida, if you know what I mean. So it was $15,000 in 2017 to move my family across the country out of my own pockets. And I do distinctly remember just the gasoline to make that drive in that one vehicle, because my wife went later because we were selling our house. That was $800 just in the gasoline, Charles. And that was when gas was cheap. Right now, gas is like $3 a gallon. Now you're going to be paying probably 3 times as much. So again, I'm rambling here, Charles, but the point is that, yes, there are a ton of considerations that a person has to take into consideration. One of them is the sense of community, the sense of family. But to me, since some of those are hard for me to develop, then it's also well, what is the foundation for the sense of community and the foundation for the sense of family, meaning like-minded people, right? Do people value freedom? Do people value hard work? Do people value taking care of yourself, not complaining and not asking for things to be handled? These are all of the things that I'm thinking when I take all of this into consideration. So did you have anything you wanted to add on top of that, Charles?
Yeah, let's talk about cost, because one of the drivers of economic decline is when costs get too high for 90% of the people, right? And that's like I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for almost 30 years. I don't live there now. I moved out partly because of the cost. It's like $3,000 to rent an apartment. Well, wait a minute. How many people, net $3,000 plus another couple thousand for living? So you got to net 5,000. You got to make 8,000, pay 3 in tax. It's all like 8 times 12. Oh, you have to make $100,000 to have your own apartment in the San Francisco Bay Area. I mean, it's like, that's nuts, because that's even in there with high wages. Most people don't make that much money. And so then you get the situation where the people that bought their house 20 or 30 or 40 years ago are sitting fat and happy. They're rich, their mortgage is cheap, their property taxes are low. And then everybody that came in the last decade is scraping by, having paid $1 million for some, house that needed 50 grand in repairs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like the cost structure is important. And a lot of rural America, the cost structure is very low. Property taxes are low, houses are still more reasonable, and the cost of living can be lower, right, than the big cities. And so if there's a reversal, and believe me, people think, oh no, there's no reversal. People always move from the countryside into the cities. No, there are reversals. And you look at what happened in New York City in the 70s and other big cities, they kind of went downhill, as you said, and they went downhill very fast, and then they trapped the people who were there, because you can't sell anymore for $1 million, right? And so when things unravel, they unravel quickly, and that's what social turmoil is like. And then suddenly the place that you thought was safe is not safe, and and then you can't sell for what you thought your house was worth because you waited too long. So anyways, cost structure, in other words, what is property tax? What are the wages, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some places in the US that living is a lot cheaper. And there's other places that are so expensive. Your whole life revolves around just scraping by. You don't have any money to travel or do anything else because you got to pay rent or this gigantic mortgage, or places like Illinois and California, the property tax can be $20,000. So even if you paid cash for your house, you're still coming up with like $1,500 a month just for property taxes. That's insane.
Yeah, it is. And they're on a one-way street, right? They're on a one-way street. There's not like, transitory property taxes. No, those are going up and up. And it drives me crazy because just how, and this is kind of off topic here, but just how disingenuous the whole entire system is, Charles, with the CPI. Again, every single month I pick something out of the CPI, just like I pick something out of the jobs report. And last jobs report, for 5 months in a row, in the very first paragraph of the jobs report, for 5 months in a row, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has specifically noted improving employment conditions in transportation and warehousing. Charles, the supply chain disruptions are getting worse. They're not getting any better. That's just a, and then the CPI, right? The CPI. Everybody wants to talk about the 7% headline inflation or hedonic adjustments or homeowners equivalent rent. Yeah, we all know these things. But the point is that there are other little nuances in the CPI that are so severely understated. Like, look at the price of dairy. The government is trying to say that the price of dairy only went up 1.6% throughout 2021. When I know for a fact, thanks to the beauty of the internet and search function and your purchase history, that I was paying like $1.69 for a gallon of milk in December 2019. I was paying $2.05 for a gallon of milk in December of 2020. Last month, December of 2021, I was paying $2.80 for a gallon of milk. And if I wanted to buy a gallon of milk at Walmart right now, it would cost $2.84, Charles. So it's just like, it's such a disingenuous system when it comes to how much things actually cost versus the real world. Did you have any thoughts you wanted to add on to that, Charles?
Well, that's a great point, Paul. And as you say, the whole idea of measuring inflation is riddled with gaming to mask the reality. And I'm old enough that I remember that my first job picking pineapple for Dole Pineapple. That my first corporate job, not babysitting or mowing lawns and stuff for my neighbors, all that kind of informal stuff I did. But we were paid $1.65, and I think if you did a purchasing power analysis, in other words, what could you buy with $1.65 times 40 hours of work, and now I've concluded it's around $18 an hour. That's what it would take to buy what I could buy, because rent was much cheaper. I could rent a studio in a very expensive city, Honolulu, for like $125 still back then. Everything was cheaper. Everything, food, insurance. Now you basically, I could buy health insurance, for $50 a month or something. Now it's like, it's unaffordable. So anyways, everyone's saying, well, the minimum wage, it's got $12, it's too much, I can't afford it, or 15, oh my gosh, the country's going to dissolve and break into pieces if we have to pay people $15. And I'm thinking, actually, that's still not as much as I made in 1970 in terms of what your money bought. So I guess our point here is, in choosing a place to move to, you want to move to a place where there's opportunities to live low to the ground in terms of low expenses, right? And you can't help the fact that insurance is going to be ridiculous, healthcare is going to be ridiculous, et cetera, et cetera. But if there's any opportunity to live lower to the ground, like use less, need less, then your dependency is considerably less. In other words, like if you've got a 100-mile commute, and that's a problem. You're going to be burning a huge amount of fuel, right? If you're going to be living in a place that's super cold, you're going to need to heat the place, and then there's all those things. Well, can I insulate my house, to the point where I can reduce? There's a lot of calculations there, but the whole point is, the less you need, and the less you use, then the easier it's going to be to have a nice life. Really, that's the bottom line. And the less dependent you are on stuff that comes from thousands of miles away, then the less likely disruptions are going to ruin your life. So right? That's your point. Yeah.
So let's stick on this theme for a minute here, Charles. And it's interesting because, in the early 1990s, myself, and it's funny because I was cutting grass and babysitting too when I was a kid, just under the table. And that's how things were, and now you need like a license to be able to be a babysitter. It's like, what the heck is that? You got to go register at the fire department. It's like, if the kid dies while you're babysitting them, I don't know. I don't want to go down that route. But here's the point, right? I was making $11 an hour just in a crappy pizzeria, multiple pizzerias, right? Because I worked in various ones when I was a teenager and shortly out of high school, making $11 an hour in the early 1990s. And just now my daughter got a job at Panera Bread making 12. So it's like not really a lot of progress there at all, Charles. But that's my point. My point is, we've been talking so far about moving, relocating, some of these bigger picture. I don't want to even call it extreme, because to me, it's just normal. That's what you do. Life gives you opportunities, and you either take them or you sit and just say whatever, and I can never improve my situation in life. But my point is that, when it comes down to things that we can do, it's not just, or maybe it's totally out of the reach of somebody to get up and move across the country. So what are some of the other things that a person can do to navigate in this difficult market and economic landscape, Charles?
Well, that's a good point, Paul. A good question, and I don't want to sound negative, but it's like we as individuals cannot counter all the dependencies and weaknesses in the region we live in. That's why we're talking about moving. Is that there's only so much you can do if you live inside a city that's unraveling. That's bankrupt and it's civically bankrupt and in other words, let me just talk about the culture. If the culture in the place you live is the fortress mentality, where everybody feels like the world is terribly unsafe, and so you've got to be in a gated community and all this kind of stuff, you're not going to be able to overcome any of those cultural problems, right? In other words, a fortress mentality where no one wants to know you, no one wants to share anything, everybody's just locked up in their house, a fearful. I mean, I don't want to live in a place like that, and so there's only so much you can do to reduce your dependencies. You can use less and so on, but moving is the ultimate is the ultimate way of changing your circumstances. Sad to say, and so that's why we're talking about it. Now, I want to mention real quickly that we're talking about regions, and there's cultural and ethnic and a lot of different issues, and I'll just mention, that I have read that a lot of African American families that are in the upper north. The upper Midwest, like in the Chicago area, for example, are finding favor to move back to the South because they feel culturally connected. They still have family there. They have their church, and it's they feel more comfortable, and so there's less social discord in a lot of places in the South, right? And so there are these cultural movements that I think we're all part of, and that if you can find a place that you connect with, then your life is going to change in ways that you can't change it if you're in some kind of urban zone that's falling apart. I'm really sorry, like in other words, where I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a homeless encampment, multiple ones that are now permanent, a block from my apartment. Well, you can't change that. I'm really sorry. You can hope for it and try and vote for somebody, or you can, try to be part of the food bank, but you're not going to change those kind of massive social problems that, when you price everybody out and it's $3,000 to rent an apartment, you're going to have homelessness, which is going to increase. And then you're going to have all the problems that go with that. And you can't fix that yourself. So the only thing you can do is move. You can fix that part yourself.
It kind of sounds like what I'm hearing is stuff is changing all around you, whether you want it or not, whether you can stop it or not. So the change that you want to become has to start from inside and work its way out. Is that a good way to kind of think about it like that?
Yeah, I think so. And that some places are going to work better and be less dependent and be more self-sufficient. They're not going to be totally self-sufficient, but that's okay. We're just trying to reduce our exposure to these forces that are beyond our control. So, I myself, I'm into gardening. I've always, thought that gardening was fun, and, I enjoy it. But it reduces your exposure because you don't need to buy every tiny bit of food, you eat. You can grow some, and if you have a surplus, then you can trade it with other people or share it, and then that's a community building thing. And so, Paul, people have forgotten that even big cities like Paris and London, back in the 19th century, there were still millions of people there, but they grew half of their food within the city limits. Now, I mean, the extended, the suburbs and the whole thing. In other words, it was normal that people had a few chickens or a few geese, or they had a garden or a few fruit trees. Well, all that's been lost, right? We grow almost nothing. There's a few community gardens, and some cities like Detroit are making a big effort to expand their community gardens, and I applaud that. I think that's the future. So you want to be in a place like that where people are even if they're so-called poor in terms of their money, the wealth they own might be limited, but they're rich in like looking ahead and taking action. And as you say, figuring out something they can do to reduce their dependency, increase their self-reliance, and build a stronger community of sharing as opposed to the fortress mentality.
Those are very awesome points and very great points, and I appreciate you for sharing those with us, Charles. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit here, but stay on the same topic because I guess I want to get down even a little bit deeper in what the root cause or the root solution to one and the same thing is. And that probably didn't even make sense, but let me explain it. I've heard you say before, like, and it basically comes down to a corrupt, debt-based, what I call it is unbacked, debt-based fiat currency dependent on exponential unsustainable growth, right? The US dollar is what I'm talking about. It comes back to a corrupt, rigged monetary system. And I want to talk about, spend the last part of our discussion in our podcast today, just talking about some of these solutions, because in my mind, it seems right now there's three solutions. And to me, it's not even really a choice in my mind, right? It's gold and silver. That's money, period. That's what's in the Constitution. It's specific by name. It's and, it's not or, and it works so well, and it's what made America great. And I do believe that just like the sea turtles who hatch on the beach and know how to get to the ocean, I do believe that we'll be going back to gold and silver. The question is, how much pain do we have to endure before we get there? But there seems to be two other competing, like, I don't want to call them like what to do for this overall systemic problem as opposed to individually what we can do. But one of these schools of thoughts is the cryptocurrency. And I mean, I don't understand how that is a solution as opposed to just an unbacked debt-based liability, right? Because with cryptocurrency, there's energy debt, right? And that's one thing. And yeah, I get it, the distributed ledger. I mean, I had Napster back when that was a thing too, before they shut it down and changed it completely, right? So, I mean, I understand how these things work and understand the energy dynamic and the fact that, you know, if you hand me some Bitcoin on a flash drive, well, that's nothing really. That's a flash drive, which might be worth something, but what's in it, unless you authenticate it with Bitcoin's centralized nodes, which just happen to be distributed and could be peer-to-peer, although not to get it authenticated, and I'm rambling again, but the point is, to me, cryptocurrency is not the solution because it is a debt-based liability. It's not a digital asset. It's a liability. It's an energy debt. It's an energy liability. Now, I've heard you say, and I don't know if I'm going to be like playing devil's advocate here or what, but I've heard you talk before about like a monetary system based on labor. And I might be paraphrasing you wrong or saying this wrong, but I think I've heard you say before about how like, well, instead of getting paid in gold or silver, well, you don't use those words specifically, but in money, you could get paid in labor. And the problem I have with that is at that point, it becomes a judgment and a value based on who's to decide what the labor is worth. Let me give you a hypothetical example, and it's hypothetical, but not really. And let's take like a modern day example of an Amazon employee. So let's say that I know this Amazon employee who has to do between 180 and 210 packages per hour, and they bust their butt every single day. And when they come home at the end of the day, they're tired and they don't have a lot of energy and resources to just like live a meaningful life because they're busting their butt all day for corporate America. But then the other person, you know, maybe they can't work as fast, and for whatever reason, they can only do 100 packages an hour. And then maybe the other person, maybe they don't even show up to work for 3 days. So how do you really value that labor on a fixed, defined level, I guess is my point with that. So again, I'm jumbling and I'm rambling, and that's what I do best. But as far as these systemic solutions, help me understand why it could be anything other than gold or silver coin, Charles.
Okay. Well, that's a great topic, Paul, and I appreciate you bringing it up. And let me kind of break it down as I analyze it. Okay. So let's start with the difference between being a consumer society and a productive society. And I think what we've lost is we've now focused solely on being a consumer society. In other words, now all we talk about is universal basic income, like give me free money so I can spend it on corporate America stuff so corporate America can make trillions in profit. It's all like, well, wait a minute, what are we producing as a nation and as an individual? And it's all like, no, we don't care about productivity. We offshored that. All we care about is consuming. And it's all like, no, I think we're down the wrong path. Okay. So that's one issue. We want to encourage and incentivize being productive, you know, and that can mean everything from a home garden to a home business to, you know, you name it, right? It's like being productive. It doesn't have to be super productive. We don't have to be making, you know, electric cars. It just has to be being productive as opposed to just focusing everything on consumption, right? That's the difference. It's a mental state, right? And it's a value system. The other thing is, here's the problem with our system of fiat money, which, as you described very accurately, is that trillions are printed and it goes to the top 1/10 of 1%, right? It goes to corporations, it goes to the super wealthy, it goes to financiers, right? They are the ones who get all that money. They're the ones who get the really low interest rates, so they can outbid the rest of us. They can outbid for the house in Montana. They can outbid for the share of Tesla. They can outbid all of us. And so that's the problem, is until that system collapses, they can own all the Bitcoin and all the gold and silver too, or most of it. And so then that's the problem with depending on a system that the super wealthy have already got the first dibs on it. They're going to own most of it. They already do. Even Bitcoin, it's for so-called being distributed. It's like the vast majority of Bitcoin is held by a handful of whales, right? And then in terms of mining, it's a handful of miners, have the wealth to buy the fast machines that mine the Bitcoin. So those systems are, even though they could be decentralized, they're not, because the people that get the first dibs on the trillions of fiat currency created out of thin air are buying up everything else. And so we have to have a system of some kind of system, and it's not one that solves every problem. Like, that's my other point. I'm all for having gold and silver. I'm also a fan of a currency that's based on oil and natural gas. In other words, it's backed by something as opposed to nothing. But I think that we really have to have a thing where, at the small community scale, someone who does something useful, like babysits kids or visits old people or works at the farmer's market. If the economy can't pay them for whatever reason, we have to have some other way to pay them. And so then the way to do it is to create a form of money that only comes into existence when labor that benefits the community is performed. And so I understand what you're saying. How do we value this? And it's going to be sloppy, because capitalism is all about, I'm going to hire you, Paul, if you can make me a profit, right? And if somebody else can make me more profit, then I'll fire you and hire them. And I grew up in construction, and that's the way it works. Like, if somebody else is faster and better and cleaner carpenter than me, I'm going to be fired and they're going to be hired, because they're going to make the boss more money. Okay, that's okay in certain ways, right? I mean, that system is Darwinian, but it's very productive. But a lot of life is not really, it's not about being productive or profit. It's about doing stuff that's useful for the community. And that's not necessarily profitable. Like, in other words, it's, and so I think I see it as the system can work together with gold and silver, but for people who are poor, they don't have gold and silver, and it's hard for them to get it. And so as an employer, I might have a hard time getting gold and silver to pay somebody too. So we're going to have some kind of script. That's a term we use for, like, money that's not backed by gold and silver. But it was, if you look at early America, it's very interesting, because in the early 1800s, it was a really fast-growing nation, and people were on the make. People wanted to improve themselves. They wanted to move. They wanted to get more land. They wanted to so on. Well, they didn't have enough money. And if you don't have enough money, then it's hard to expand. So then there was all these local banks that created, like, credit. And a lot of them weren't backed by what they claim, right? So there was a lot of bank failures, and it was this real churn, And so my point being, if we look at history, there's a role for both. There's a role for gold and silver as being like a store of value that you can count on. But if you want to stimulate your economy, then you need some kind of localized or script money that people can trade. And my idea about labor is limited. That's the problem with fiat. There's no limit. Hey, if you and I got barged in and took over the Federal Reserve, we could each print $1 trillion and give it to ourselves. Yay, or 10 trillion. But labor is limited. There's only so many people. There's only so many hours per day. And so you're not going to be able to hyperinflate a currency based on labor because there's only so many people in the community and only so many hours in the day. And so you can say, well, this person's labor is more valuable than that. That's absolutely true. And so my judgment would be the community has to follow certain rules. It's not just up to anybody who gets paid. And so my system was, here are the rules that you have to follow. And so each group, there is a community group that controls the labor, that manages it and reports it. There has to be proof the work was done. Only then does the script get issued. And so, again, in crisis, we have to look beyond the normal solutions. That's the issue. And so this is one idea that I think could have value, maybe not, but we have to explore, beyond the status quo.
This is great, Charles. This is great. I'm so excited about your solutions and stuff like that because I wasn't really thinking about it that way because I'm a silver bug and I don't know, but I totally see what you're saying and like there has to be some sort of stake, there has to be some sort of incentive because here's the thing, right? Just how a little bit ago you said, sorry, you just got to move if your area is collapsing, which is kind of obvious, right? Like now that I think about it in that sense, you're like, I wish I had better news, but sorry, sometimes you're going to have to move. And if you're in one of these areas, move, right? Like that's the bottom line. But on that same token, like we've got to get to something, whether that's something, it's not going to be crypto, but whether it's gold and silver, whether it's labor-based, as you're talking about, we've got to get to something, right? Or whether it's a combination of those things, I'll go as far as to say that that's cool too, right? But we've got to get to something. But the problem is where I don't have any kind of rosy outlook on this is that, well, the people that we have in charge, they're not going to get us there, right? They're not going to take us there. They're going to just, I don't know, like you've said before, and this is something I've also heard you say. You said like there's a choice, right? Like it's save the dollar or save the empire. I'm paraphrasing, but you said something to the effect that you either save the dollar or you save the empire. What if there's a third choice, right? And I actually wrote this down as a note, but here's the third choice. What if the third choice is this? What if it's really just a bunch of rats fleeing from a sinking ship that also happens to be on fire and infested with zombies, right? So that's, what if that's the scenario, right? What if it's not, so if that's the third option, it's kind of like grab whatever you can and hope you can swim to shore, right? So that's like the third choice, because in my mind, I do not see any of our elected leaders or public servants doing the right thing for the foreseeable future until after there's been this absolutely horrendous and horrible crisis that vaporizes all the phantom wealth around. What am I missing, Charles?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that scenario is right. And the leadership is the zombies on the ship, right? They're just kind of going through the motions of acting like they know what they're doing. So let's I mentioned at the end of the article that you're referring to, that I talk about should you move when you can or when you must, is an essay I wrote back in 2008, and I think it was called it referred to the Taoism, the Chinese philosophy, and the Warring States period in China.
The art of survival, Taoism and the Warring States.
Yeah, and what it really that sounds like it's going to be a history about China, but it's actually about the idea that was very prevalent at the time of preppers, that you go and you build a little shack somewhere in the deep woods, and you stock it with ammo and canned foods and this and that, and that's going to be your like bug out place. And I was basically trying to explain that from my point of view and my life experience, what you want to do is you want to buy in a town or a neighborhood, and you want to be friendly with your neighbors, and you want to have some kind of surplus, like your labor, your skills, food, whatever. You have something that you can give and share, and people will go, hey, that guy, that person, that family's nice, and then you start building bonds, and then somebody, shares something with you, and you have a community that you can build around various things, work, church, farmer's market, whatever. That's the human solution to what you're talking about, is that we actually are a social animal, right? And we do best when we're in a community where we can cooperate. That's the sort of selective advantage of humanity over the other species, right? Is we can cooperate, we can share information, we can share essentials, and we can help each other. And so that's where I think you want to find a place where you can fit in and contribute, right? And contributing feels good, right? I mean, we share with our neighbors, hey, it's a nice feeling. Everybody's happy. Then they give you something back. It's, hey, this is great. And if you're doing work, then you're contributing to your community and people appreciate you. That feels good too. And so that's what I think the solution is. Now, what happens to the empire or the dollar? Right now, the odds are not looking good in either case, right? Because of all the things we're talking about, scarcity and the social collapse from vast inequalities, and not just inequality in wealth, inequality in political power and access to resources and so on. So that's where I think we're the third path that you're talking about is, get to a place where the community is productive and people still want to be productive. They don't just want to, get, UBI off the government and they're just, they're actually want to be productive and enjoy that and understand that it's valuable. And then instead of the fortress mentality that, it's like people go, well, I actually like where I'm living and I like my neighbors and, like that. That's where you want to be. And that place is going to have, it's not going to be problem free, but it's going to be much more sustainable than some place that's totally dependent on stuff coming on diesel trucks from hundreds or thousands of miles away. And let me just give you one little tiny example. Paul, you served in Iraq, okay? I guess you didn't have to go to Afghanistan, but I'm going to mention Afghanistan. Everybody talks about, Eastern Afghanistan's got billions of lithium and all this kind of stuff. Okay, well, number one, it's a very high desert. There's no rivers. There's no ports. It's not close to the ocean. There's no fuel. There's no oil wells. So, okay, let's talk about that. It took the United States 10 years to build one highway. So how are you going to get to this place? And where's all the diesel going to come from? Because you're going to need 10,000 gigantic trucks that are going to be using this road. And they're going to be going to a port. Because if you're got all this ore and all this stuff, it's very heavy and you're going to have to get it to a seaport or a river port. And so it's like, in other words, we have all this kind of magical thinking that people think is optimism, but there's a difference. Optimism is realistic. Magical thinking is just is in woo-woo land. And so a lot of what we're told is, we're all going to be having electric helicopters, our private, electric helicopters and all this kind of stuff. It's all like, no, I'm sorry, man. That's not optimism. That's magical thinking. What optimism is, hey, here's a place that actually grows food, that it rains enough and there's a river nearby and people are actually interested in helping their community and being productive. That's the real world to be optimistic about. Not like, oh gosh, I can hardly wait till I can buy my own personal electric helicopter. No.
I can start walking from the house and I can be to a river in like less than 15 minutes, walking the way the crow flies. And actually not really the way the crow flies, just down a couple roads. And they got like huge walleye here and I've never caught one, but I'm sure they would be good eating. But like, I agree with that completely. So Charles, haven't done a lot of podcasts lately. I'm still going through a little bit of issues here with just the silver community in general. I'm kind of like in exile still, unfortunately. But I do like to talk to you, Charles, because you don't mind if I kind of call you out and put you on the spot and make you feel uncomfortable, which I'm sure I did about the labor thing. You knocked it out of the park, and I'm glad you had a good comeback for me because I've always wanted to ask you that. I'm glad I was able to just now. But, Charles, as we move here through the first few months of 2022, I don't know. I'm expecting more of the same that we saw in 2020-21, really. To give you a specific example of that, I wish I had them out here, but I don't right now. But it's just more inflation, more deterioration of the markets and of the economy, and just more bad stuff overall on a systemic level, but not necessarily for the individual level. And that's what I'm looking at. In particular, I'm really got my eye on when the Dollar Tree is going to raise their price across the board for a $1.25 price point nationwide, things like that, right? Things that affect the little guy, right? Like myself. But what are you looking at right now as we go through the first few months of this year? There's been so much going on, whether it's between the China stockpiling or the Russia who knows what build up on the borders and all this geopolitical stuff. But even in the United States, there's all of this stuff too. We got the surging inflation that's combined with retail sales that are plummeting. That's combined with unemployment that's supposedly miraculous, but nobody's in the workforce anymore. So like as we move through these winter months here in 2022, what's on your radar the most, or what are a couple things on your radar, and what can you leave our listeners with today, Charles?
Well, thank you, Paul. And it's a great question. I think what I'm looking at is the total dependence of the American economy and society on speculation. And I think that's very unhealthy, and I don't think it's going to end well, because speculative bubbles always pop. No matter how much we believe and hope and pray it's not going to happen, it always happens. So you're a silver bug. I've often been accused. I mean, for the 15 years I've been writing the blog, I often get accused of being a gold bug. Well, I am, in the sense that, look at where are you going to put your money? In some sort of speculative meme stock? Well, you might make a killing, but you can also end up getting killed, right? Because it's really tricky with speculation. So if you buy gold or silver, or if you buy some land somewhere, that's there. Okay, when the bubble pops, you still got whatever you got. Now, whether the price of gold and silver goes up or down, my point of view is it's kind of like if you own a house or a land. I don't care if the price of my house doubles or falls in half. It's like I'm still living here. It's providing utility. And so the same with gold and silver. Just buy it and forget it, unless you're trying to speculate. But if you're just looking at it, it's like, well, what are you going to do with whatever little savings you have? Well, I'd say buy something that's going to still be here, whatever happens to the speculative bubble. That's what I'm focusing on, because I see a huge number of people who are so confident and blasé and so sure that the speculative bubble is only going to get bigger. It's only going to keep getting more and more, and it's all like, no, I don't think that's the way things. That's not what history tells us. So. Yeah, you want to start buying stuff that's still going to be here when the speculation, blows up. And you also want to invest in yourself, right? That's another one of my standard things is, if you have skills, you're going to be able to trade your skill and labor for whatever form of money is out there, because people will have a need for what your skills are. So invest in yourself. Don't invest in speculative bubbles. I mean, if you want to play around with a few dollars, that's fine, but put your main effort in yourself and your family and in your skill sets, which can't be taken away from you, by the way.
Well, there you go, folks. It might be getting terrible for the United States as a whole, but individually and as families and communities, there is a lot to look forward to. And if you are into reading, I especially recommend reading Global Crisis, National Renewal, a Revolutionary Grand Strategy for the United States, which is your new book. And congratulations on that. I have been looking over it, but I haven't finished it yet because it's over 200 pages long and it's one heck of a deal, and I'm excited about it. But Charles, that's great, because we can take the pessimism and we can turn it into optimism. And I thank you for doing that again with me today. Charles Hugh Smith, I'd like to thank you for joining us again on Silver Doctors.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciated all your questions.